January 3, 1943 dawned cold and merciless over the Belgian countryside, the kind of morning that chilled bomber crews to their bones before they even climbed into their aircraft. Staff Sergeant Alan Magee squeezed himself into the ball turret of his B-17 Flying Fortress, a cramped glass sphere suspended beneath the bomber's belly, where he would spend the next several hours scanning the skies for German fighters. At 20 years old, the turret gunner from Plainfield, New Jersey, had already survived 11 combat missions over Nazi-occupied Europe. He couldn't have known that his 12th mission would transform him into one of the most remarkable survival stories in military aviation history. The mission briefing that morning had been straightforward enough. Bomb the submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire, France, a heavily fortified target that had already claimed dozens of American aircraft. Magee's bomber, christened Snap, Crackle, Pop, belonged to the 367th Bomb Squadron, 8th Air Force, and she carried a crew of 10 men who trusted their lives to each other and to the aircraft's reputation for toughness. The B-17 had earned its Flying Fortress nickname honestly, bristling with machine guns and capable of absorbing tremendous punishment while still bringing its crew home. As the formation of bombers droned eastward across the English Channel, Magee rotated his turret continuously, his gloved hands gripping the twin 50 caliber machine guns that were his only defense against the Luftwaffe fighters he knew would come. The ball turret was perhaps the most vulnerable position on the entire aircraft, a transparent bubble that offered 360-degree visibility, but also meant that enemy fighters could see him just as clearly as he could see them. Many ball turret gunners didn't survive direct attacks, and those who did often suffered psychological trauma from the experience of being so exposed to enemy fire while unable to escape their cramped position. The German interceptors appeared exactly when and where intelligence had predicted they would. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s swarmed the American formation like angry hornets, their cannon shells and machine gun bullets tearing through the thin aluminum skin of the bombers. Magee's hands moved with practiced efficiency, tracking targets and squeezing off controlled bursts that sent tracer rounds streaking toward the attacking fighters. The noise inside the ball turret became deafening as his own guns roared and enemy rounds clanged against the bomber's frame. Then everything changed in an instant. A German fighter's cannon shell exploded directly against Magee's turret, and the young sergeant felt a sledgehammer blow to his right arm as shrapnel tore through flesh and bone. Blood immediately began pooling in his heated flight suit, but there was no time to assess the damage. More fighters were coming, and his crew needed every gun firing to have any chance of survival. Through the haze of shock and pain, Alan Magee did something that would define his character for the rest of his life. He kept shooting. The sky around Snap, Crackle, Pop had transformed into a hellscape of smoke, fire, and disintegrating metal. Magee's wounded arm hung nearly useless, but his left hand continued manipulating the turret controls while his functioning fingers maintained pressure on the firing mechanism. Every burst from his gun sent jolts of agony through his shattered limb, but the alternative was watching helplessly as German fighters lined up for killing shots on his friends above him. The historical account documented in the Air Force's official records and later detailed in the Saturday Evening Post's 1943 coverage of his ordeal confirms that Magee continued engaging enemy aircraft even as his own blood froze in the sub-zero temperatures at 20,000 feet altitude. The aircraft commander, Second Lieutenant William Greer, fought to keep the bomber in formation while his crew called out fighter positions and damage reports over the intercom. The B-17's No. 3 engine was already trailing thick black smoke, and the No. 4 showed signs of losing oil pressure. Holes appeared in the wings and fuselage as if by magic, each one representing a near miss that could easily have been catastrophic. The bomber's defensive firepower was legendary, but against the concentrated attacks of experienced Luftwaffe pilots, even the Flying Fortress's 11 machine guns seemed inadequate. Magee rotated his turret to track another FW-190 making an attack run from below, the German pilot clearly believing the ball turret gunner must be dead or incapacitated given the damage to that section of the aircraft. The Nazi flyer had miscalculated. Magee's remaining functional fingers found the trigger again, and his guns hammered out another burst that caused the Focke-Wulf to break off its attack with smoke trailing from its cowling. Whether he had scored a kill or simply damage the fighter enough to discourage further engagement? Meiji never knew, but the German peeled away and didn't return. The respite lasted only seconds before a Messerschmitt appeared from the bomber's vulnerable 6 o'clock position, its nose guns winking with muzzle flashes. Meiji felt more impacts against his turret housing and heard the screaming of ricochets inside the confined space. The acrid smell of cordite mixed with the metallic scent of his own blood, and he could feel consciousness starting to slip away at the edges. The combination of blood loss, oxygen deprivation from possible damage to his oxygen system, and shock was creating a dangerous physiological cascade. Then came the hit that changed everything. A 20-millimeter cannon shell from another attacking fighter struck the bomber's wing root, and the explosion sent shrapnel slicing through critical hydraulic lines and structural components. The B-17 shuddered violently, and Meiji heard the pilot's urgent voice over the intercom ordering the crew to prepare for the possibility of bailing out. The words sent ice through the young gunner's veins that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. Ball turret gunners faced a unique nightmare in bailout situations. They had to exit their turret, crawl back into the aircraft's fuselage, retrieve their parachute from where it was stored inside the bomber, clip it on, and then jump. All of this while the aircraft might be spinning, burning, or breaking apart. Meiji tried to rotate his turret to the exit position, but found the mechanism jammed, possibly from battle damage or hydraulic failure. He cranked the manual backup system with his one functional arm, each rotation sending fresh waves of agony through his body. The turret moved with agonizing slowness, and through his small windows, he could see other B-17s in the formation falling out of the sky, some with parachutes blossoming beneath them, others simply spiraling downward, trailing smoke and flames. The bomber's intercom crackled with increasingly desperate damage reports. The tail gunner, Sergeant Michael Russo, reported that the entire tail section was vibrating so violently he feared it would separate from the fuselage. The top turret gunner saw flames beginning to lick back from the No. 3 engine toward the wing fuel tanks. The navigator calculated they were still 40 miles from the English Channel, deep over occupied France, where capture or death awaited any airman who survived reaching the ground. These details, corroborated by witness statements collected by military historians and preserved in the National Archives, paint a picture of an aircraft in its death throes. Lieutenant Greer made the hardest decision any aircraft commander ever faces. His voice came over the intercom with forced calm. "Bail out. Bail out. Bail out." The order was repeated 3 times according to standard procedure, though everyone aboard understood the first time that their beloved bomber was lost. Men began moving toward escape hatches, grabbing parachutes and helping wounded crewmates prepare to jump. The waist gunners opened the side door, and the howling wind that blasted through the fuselage was so strong it knocked one man off his feet. Meiji finally succeeded in cranking his turret to the exit position and began the awkward process of extracting himself from the ball, a maneuver that was challenging even in perfect health, and nearly impossible with one arm mangled and useless. He hauled himself through the small hatch into the bomber's belly, his boots slipping on his own frozen blood that had dripped down from the turret. The immediate priority was his parachute, stored in a rack near his position. He crawled toward it, vision tunneling from blood loss and hypoxia, his fingers closed around empty air. The parachute rack was empty. In the chaos of the battle and the crew's hasty evacuation, someone had grabbed the wrong parachute, or perhaps the rack had been damaged and the parachute thrown loose. Meiji's mind raced through the possibilities with the clarity that sometimes comes in moments of extreme crisis. He could search the aircraft for another parachute, but the bomber was now in a steep dive and breaking up. He could stay with the aircraft and ride it down, guaranteeing death. Or he could jump without a parachute and accept the infinitesimally small chance that something, anything, might break his fall. The decision was made in an instant. Alan Meiji dragged himself to the open waist door where moments before his crewmates had jumped to safety. Below him stretched the patchwork fields of occupied France, impossibly far away, impossibly hard. The bomber lurched violently, and Meiji felt the deck tilting beneath him at an increasingly severe angle. Metal groaned and rivets popped as structural elements began failing. He had perhaps seconds before the aircraft entered an uncontrollable spin or simply disintegrated. He jumped. The wind struck him like a physical wall, tumbling him end over end in the -40-degree temperatures of the stratosphere. His wounded arm flailed uselessly as he spun through space, and the pain was so intense that for a moment he nearly blacked out. But consciousness remained, bringing with it the terrible awareness that he was falling 4 miles toward the earth with no parachute, no hope, and no chance of survival. The official Army Air Force's accident investigation report, filed weeks later, would estimate his terminal velocity at approximately 120 miles per hour by the time he neared ground level. The human body was never designed for uncontrolled free fall from 20,000 feet. Alan McGee's mind struggled to process the sensory overload as he plummeted through the frigid upper atmosphere. The roar of wind in his ears drowned out all other sound, and the centrifugal force of his tumbling spin pressed his cheeks back against his skull and made his eyes water uncontrollably. He couldn't tell up from down, couldn't orient himself, couldn't do anything except fall and wait for the impact that would end his life. Physiologists who later studied his case, including researchers at Wright Field who published findings in aviation medicine journals in 1944, noted that McGee should have lost consciousness almost immediately due to the combination of his injuries, blood loss, cold exposure, and the disorientation of the spin. Yet somehow, impossibly, he remained aware throughout much of his descent. Perhaps it was youth. Perhaps it was the same stubborn determination that had kept him firing at enemy fighters with a shattered arm. Or perhaps it was simply that death wasn't finished toying with him yet. As he fell through 10,000 feet, the air became gradually thicker and warmer and his rate of spin began to slow. He still couldn't control his position, but the wild tumbling gave way to a more regular rotation. Through the blur of motion and tears streaming across his face, he caught fragmentary glimpses of the ground rising to meet him. Farm fields, roads, a small town with a church steeple, all growing larger with horrifying speed. His mind, operating on some level beyond conscious thought, began calculating angles and relative positions with the mechanical precision of the bomb site he'd helped operate on previous missions. The town below was Saint-Nazaire, the very target they'd been assigned to bomb that morning. The irony wasn't lost on McGee even in his extremity. He was going to die in the French town he'd been sent to destroy, killed not by German anti-aircraft fire, but by simple gravity and the absence of a silk parachute canopy. The town rushed upward, its features resolving from abstract shapes into distinct structures. He could see people in the streets now, tiny figures pointing upward at the falling man and the blazing wreckage of bombers scattered across the landscape. At 5,000 feet, McGee's body position shifted, and he found himself briefly falling in a spread eagle orientation that marginally reduced his velocity. It wasn't much, perhaps shaving 10 or 15 miles per hour off his terminal velocity, but in the desperate mathematics of survival, every reduction mattered. He couldn't maintain the position as his wounded arm refused to cooperate, and he began tumbling again, though not as violently as before. 3,000 feet, 2,000 feet, 1,000 feet. The ground details became knife-sharp. Individual roof tiles, a woman hanging laundry, a German military vehicle parked beside a requisitioned building. McGee squeezed his eyes shut, unable to watch his own death approaching. Every muscle in his body tensed instinctively, uselessly, against the impact that would pulverize bones, rupture organs, and end his consciousness in a fraction of a second. The last coherent thought that passed through his mind was a prayer that it would be quick, and that his mother would somehow learn what happened to him. The Saint-Nazaire train station's massive glass skylight had been installed in the 19th century, a marvel of French engineering that allowed natural light to flood the main passenger hall below. The reinforced glass panels, held in their iron framework 3 stories above the station floor, had survived decades of weather and the vibrations of countless trains arriving and departing. On January 3, 1943, that skylight became the most important architectural feature in Alan McGee's young life. His body struck the angled glass panels at approximately 120 miles per hour. The skylight didn't stop him, but it did something infinitely more valuable. It slowed him. The first panel he hit spiderwebbed but didn't shatter, absorbing some of his kinetic energy before giving way. He crashed through into the second layer of glass, which fractured more readily under the impact but still provided resistance. Each braking panel extracted a toll from his momentum, and the iron framework between the glass sections further disrupted his fall, causing him to carom off metal beams that transferred some of his downward velocity into lateral motion. The physics of his impact, analyzed years later by engineers and medical professionals, represented an almost impossibly fortunate chain of events. The angle of the skylight meant he didn't hit it perpendicularly, but rather at a slight diagonal, which distributed the force over a longer duration. The multiple layers of glass and the structural framework created a progressive deceleration rather than the instantaneous stop of hitting solid ground. And crucially, after breaking through the skylight, he fell the remaining distance to the station floor, where his body crashed through a wooden baggage cart that provided one final energy-absorbing collision before he came to rest on the stone floor. German soldiers stationed at the train station heard the cascading crash of breaking glass and rushed into the main hall with weapons drawn, expecting sabotage or an attack. What they found instead seemed impossible. A man in an American flight suit lying motionless amid a shower of broken glass and splintered wood, his uniform scorched and torn, one arm clearly mangled, and blood pooling beneath him. The soldiers stood frozen for several seconds, trying to reconcile what they were seeing with any rational explanation. Men didn't fall from the sky and survive. It simply didn't happen. But Alan Magee was still breathing. Barely shallowly, each breath a bubbling rasp that suggested serious internal injuries, but breathing nonetheless. A German medic pushed through the cluster of soldiers and knelt beside the American airman, checking for a pulse and finding one. Thready and irregular but present. The medic's training took over, and he began assessing the injuries with professional detachment, calling out for stretcher bearers and medical supplies. The injured flyer needed immediate treatment if he was to have any chance of survival, enemy or not. Magee drifted in and out of consciousness as the Germans loaded him onto a stretcher. When awareness returned in fragmentary moments, he registered pain so comprehensive and overwhelming that it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. His right arm was a source of particular agony, and he could feel that something was wrong with his back, his ribs, his legs, though his mind couldn't quite catalog all the damage. He tried to speak, to ask where he was or what had happened, but his jaw wouldn't move properly, and the only sound that emerged was a low moan. The Germans transported him to a military hospital in Saint-Nazaire, a facility that treated both Wehrmacht soldiers and prisoners of war. The attending physician, a career military surgeon named Dr. Heinrich Müller, according to Red Cross records later accessed by American authorities, examined the broken American airman with professional fascination. Multiple compound fractures, severe internal bleeding, probable skull fracture, massive contusions, and soft tissue damage throughout his body. Dr. Müller told his staff that the patient would likely die within hours, but medical ethics demanded they try to save him regardless. The first 48 hours in the German military hospital passed in a morphine-hazed nightmare of surgeries, pain, and delirium. Alan Magee's body, which by all rights should have been a broken corpse on the floor of the Saint-Nazaire train station, somehow clung to life with the same stubborn tenacity he'd shown while firing at German fighters with a shattered arm. Dr. Müller and his surgical team worked through the night following his arrival, setting bones, stopping internal bleeding and cleaning wounds that ranged from the shrapnel damage in his arm to lacerations caused by the broken glass that had paradoxically saved his life. The medical records preserved through the International Red Cross and later obtained by the United States Army Air Forces for their investigation documented injuries that read like a catalog of trauma. 28 shrapnel wounds, a severely compound fractured right arm requiring multiple surgeries, a collapsed lung, 3 broken ribs, a fractured lumbar vertebra, kidney damage from the impact, and severe concussion. Yet somehow, miraculously, no single injury was immediately fatal. The glass skylight and baggage cart had absorbed just enough energy to keep his impact survivable, if only barely. When consciousness returned with any clarity 3 days after his fall, Magee's first coherent thought was surprise that he could think at all. His second was the realization that he was a prisoner of war. German guards stood watch outside his hospital room, and when nurses came to change his bandages or adjust his various casts and splints, they spoke in German, which he didn't understand. The full horror of his situation began to sink in. He had survived an impossible fall, only to face years of captivity in Nazi Germany. Assuming he survived his injuries and the notoriously harsh conditions in German POW camps, a German officer who spoke excellent English visited him on the 5th day. The officer, whose name Magee later recalled as Hauptmann Schmidt, seemed genuinely curious about how an American airman had survived falling from a disintegrating bomber with no parachute. Magee, still weak but mentally clearing, told the story in halting words, though he himself barely believed it. Schmidt listened with obvious skepticism, then left to verify the account with witnesses. He returned several hours later with a changed demeanor. The story, impossible as it seemed, was true. Multiple German soldiers and French civilians had seen the American fall from the sky and crash through the train station skylight. News of the miraculous survival spread through the German military medical system and eventually reached higher commands. For propaganda purposes, the Nazis typically publicized stories that demonstrated German military prowess or Allied failures. But this story defied simple categorization. An American airman had survived something that should have killed him instantly, suggesting either divine intervention or incredible luck, neither of which fit neatly into propaganda narratives. Ultimately, the Germans decided against widely publicizing the event, though word spread through informal channels among soldiers and medical personnel. The weeks of recovery that followed were an endurance test that rivaled the fall itself. Every breath sent stabbing pains through Magee's broken ribs. His arm, held together by external pins and plaster, throbbed with a deep bone ache that never completely subsided. Physical therapy began almost as soon as doctors determined he would survive, necessary to prevent permanent disability, but agonizing in its execution. German medical personnel, to their credit, treated him with professional competence. Though resources in occupied France in 1943 were stretched thin, and luxuries like adequate pain medication were scarce. 3 months after his impossible fall, Alan Magee was transferred from the hospital to Stalag Luft III, the infamous prisoner of war camp near Sagan, Germany, that would later become famous for the Great Escape tunneling operation. He arrived at the camp still bearing a cast on his arm and walking with a pronounced limp from his back and leg injuries, looking more like a walking medical miracle than a dangerous enemy airman. The other American prisoners, most of them downed bomber crew members like himself, greeted him with a mixture of sympathy and amazement when they heard his story. Life in Stalag Luft III was a monotonous hell of hunger, cold, boredom, and the constant psychological pressure of captivity. Prisoners received barely adequate rations that left them perpetually hungry, and the barracks were heated inadequately against the brutal German winters. Yet for Magee, who had experienced the absolute certainty of death during his 4-mile fall, the miseries of camp life seemed almost trivial by comparison. He had been given an impossible second chance at life, and even barbed wire and guard towers couldn't diminish his gratitude for simply being alive. The camp's senior Allied officers, in accordance with the Geneva Convention's requirement that POWs be allowed to receive medical care, ensured that Magee continued his physical rehabilitation. An American doctor who was also a prisoner examined him regularly and expressed professional astonishment that he'd survived at all, much less with the relatively moderate permanent disabilities he'd sustained. The right arm would never regain full function and would pain him for the rest of his life, but he had use of his hand and could perform most daily tasks. His back injury left him with chronic pain and some loss of flexibility, but he could walk, stand, and care for himself. As months turned to years in captivity, Magee became something of a legend within the camp. New prisoners arriving from freshly shot-down bombers would hear about the ball turret gunner who'd fallen 4 miles without a parachute and lived, and many initially dismissed it as the kind of embellished story that circulated in any military population. But when they met Magee himself and heard the account firsthand, corroborated by others who'd heard it from German guards or Red Cross officials, they realized the impossible story was true. In the grim environment of a POW camp, his survival became a symbol of hope, proof that fate sometimes offered mercy even in the midst of war's cruelties. The years of captivity wore on through 1943 and into 1944. Magee participated in the camp's elaborate systems of distraction and resistance, study groups where prisoners taught each other subjects they knew, theatrical productions staged with improvised props and costumes, and the ever-present subtle defiance of men who refused to let their captors break their spirits. He didn't participate in the tunneling operations, his injuries making the physical labor impossible, but he supported those who did by helping conceal dirt and maintain security watches. Word filtered into the camp through secret radios and new prisoners about the war's progress. The Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944 brought hope that liberation might come sooner rather than later. The failed July assassination attempt on Hitler suggested the Nazi regime was cracking from within. The steady advance of Soviet forces from the east and American and British forces from the west meant Germany was being crushed between two overwhelming forces. Yet for the prisoners, liberation remained frustratingly distant, a future promise that might never arrive if Germany decided to massacre POWs rather than let them be freed. The winter of 1944 to 1945 brought a new nightmare to Stalag Luftwaffe's prisoners. As Soviet forces advanced rapidly westward through Poland, the German High Command ordered the evacuation of camps in the path of the Soviet advance. On January 27, 1945, in the middle of one of the coldest winters in decades, the guards roused the prisoners with orders to prepare for immediate march westward. They were given minimal time to gather possessions and no clear explanation of their destination, or how far they would travel. The forced march that followed tested the prisoners' endurance as severely as combat had. 10,000 Allied POWs, many already weakened by years of inadequate rations and some suffering from old wounds or illnesses, trudged through snow and sub-zero temperatures with insufficient clothing and almost no food. Guards drove them forward relentlessly, and those who fell behind faced being shot or left to freeze. Magee, still suffering chronic pain from his injuries 2 years earlier, forced himself to keep pace through sheer willpower. His back screamed with every step, and the cold aggravated the nerve damage in his arm until his hand went numb. But he kept moving. They marched for 60 miles over 6 days before reaching a railway junction, where the Germans loaded them into boxcars for transport deeper into Germany. The conditions in the boxcars were scarcely better than the march, overcrowded, unheated, with no sanitation and minimal food or water. Men died from exhaustion, exposure, and disease during the journey, their bodies removed at stops and left beside the tracks. Magee survived by staying close to other prisoners who helped support those struggling, the camaraderie of shared suffering keeping men alive when individual strength failed. The prisoners were eventually distributed among several camps in central Germany, and Magee ended up at a facility near Moosburg. Conditions there were chaotic, as the German military infrastructure collapsed under the weight of advancing Allied armies. Guards became increasingly erratic, some disappearing altogether as they deserted to avoid capture, while others became more brutal as their own situation grew desperate. Food supplies dwindled to near starvation levels. Disease spread through the crowded barracks. Rumors circulated that Hitler had ordered all POWs executed rather than liberated, though whether these rumors were true or psychological warfare was impossible to determine. Through April 1945, the sounds of artillery grew louder day by day, and Allied aircraft flew overhead with impunity, sometimes strafing German positions visible from the camp. The guards grew nervous, and prisoners debated whether to attempt mass escape or wait for liberation, knowing that either choice carried mortal risk. Magee, having survived an impossible fall and 2 years of captivity, found himself facing the possibility that he might die in the war's final days, killed by a trigger-happy guard or caught in the crossfire of liberation. On April 29, 1945, American tanks from the 14th Armored Division rolled up to the gates of the Moosburg camp. The guards, faced with overwhelming force, surrendered without resistance. When the gates swung open and American soldiers entered the compound, the scene that followed was one of emotional chaos. Prisoners weeping with relief, soldiers shocked by the condition of the men they'd liberated, and the shared understanding that they had all survived a war that had consumed millions. Alan Magee walked through those gates on his own 2 feet, a free man for the first time in more than 2 years. The journey home began with medical evaluations at field hospitals near the German-Austrian border, where doctors examined the former prisoners and prioritized their evacuation based on medical need. Majee's chronic injuries and significant weight loss earned him an early spot on a transport aircraft flying to Paris, where a more comprehensive medical facility could assess what 2 years of captivity had done to his still healing body. The examining physicians marveled at his medical history, the fall that should have killed him, the survival against impossible odds, and now 2 years in captivity that he'd somehow endured despite injuries that should have made him particularly vulnerable. From Paris, he was flown to England and then, in late May 1945, across the Atlantic to the United States aboard a hospital ship. The voyage took 8 days, and Majee spent much of it on deck, staring at the ocean and processing the reality that the war was over for him, that he was going home, that he had survived when so many others hadn't. Germany had surrendered on May 8th, and Japan would surrender 3 months later. The war that had consumed the world was ending, and he had lived to see it. His arrival in New York Harbor brought a reunion with his family that nearly overwhelmed him emotionally. His mother, who had received the telegram informing her he was missing in action in January 1943, and then later notification that he was a prisoner of war, had spent more than 2 years not knowing if she would ever see her son again. She embraced him on the dock while his father stood nearby, both parents visibly shocked by how thin he was, but overjoyed beyond words that he was alive. They knew pieces of his story, the censored versions that had come through official channels, but they didn't yet know the full extent of what he'd experienced. The Army Air Forces conducted a thorough debriefing over several weeks, interested not only in Majee's experiences as a POW, but also in the remarkable circumstances of his survival. Intelligence officers interviewed him multiple times about his fall, seeking to understand exactly what had happened and whether any lessons could be learned that might help other airmen survive similar situations. Majee told the story as clearly as he could remember it, though some details remained blurred by trauma, blood loss, and the sheer impossibility of what had occurred. Military doctors examined him extensively, documenting his injuries and their healing for medical journals and training purposes. The 1943 injuries included permanent reduced mobility in his right arm, chronic back pain from the fractured vertebra that would plague him for life, and some kidney function impairment. The captivity had added malnutrition effects, minor frostbite damage from the forced march, and psychological impacts that doctors in that era had only begun to understand as combat fatigue, or what later generations would call post-traumatic stress disorder. Yet despite everything, the medical consensus was that Staff Sergeant Alan Majee had made a remarkable recovery and would be able to live a relatively normal life. The press got hold of his story in late summer 1945, and suddenly the quiet young man from New Jersey found himself the subject of national attention. Newspapers across the country ran articles about the bomber gunner who'd fallen 4 miles without a parachute and survived, often with sensationalized headlines that made the story sound even more impossible than it already was. The Saturday Evening Post published a detailed account in their September issue, complete with illustrations showing his fall through the train station skylight. Radio programs requested interviews. He received letters from across the country, from other veterans, from aviation enthusiasts, from people who simply wanted to tell him they were glad he'd survived. Alan Majee's formal military service ended with an honorable discharge in December 1945, along with the Purple Heart for his combat injuries, and the Air Medal with oak leaf clusters for his bombing missions over Europe. He returned to civilian life in New Jersey carrying visible and invisible scars from his experiences. The right arm that had been shattered by German cannon fire never fully healed, leaving him with limited range of motion and chronic pain that would intensify with age and weather changes. His back injury from the impact with the train station floor caused problems for the rest of his life, requiring careful attention to posture and limitation of heavy lifting. But the psychological impacts proved more challenging than the physical ones. In an era before widespread understanding of PTSD, Majee dealt with recurring nightmares about falling, moments of disorientation when he felt like he was tumbling through space again, and survivor's guilt over the fact that he'd lived when others from his crew had died. He learned that 3 members of Snap, Crackle, Pop hadn't survived the bailout or had been killed by German forces after landing. The knowledge that his miraculous survival came at no cost to others helped, but it didn't eliminate the complex emotions that came with being, statistically speaking, the luckiest unlucky man of World War II. He found work as a freight manager for a trucking company, a job that suited his methodical nature and didn't require the physical capabilities his injuries had taken from him. He married, raised a family, and lived a deliberately quiet life, far from the public attention his story occasionally attracted. When reporters tracked him down on milestone anniversaries of his fall, he usually declined interviews, uncomfortable with the celebrity his survival had thrust upon him. He hadn't done anything heroic, he would tell persistent journalists. He'd simply fallen and gotten impossibly lucky. Yet to aviation historians and military medical researchers, Alan Magee's survival remained one of the most significant cases in aerospace medicine history. His fall represented the extreme edge of human survivability, a data point that helped researchers understand the biomechanics of impact trauma and informed the design of aircraft escape systems. The multiple factors that had combined to save his life, the progressive energy absorption through layers of glass and structural elements, influenced thinking about crash-worthy aircraft design and emergency escape procedures. In the decades that followed, other stories of impossible survivations emerged. A flight attendant survived a fall from 33,000 feet when her aircraft broke apart over Serbia in 1972. A Royal Air Force tail gunner survived a fall from 18,000 feet during World War II when he crashed through trees and into a snowbank. But Magee's case remained unique for the specific combination of factors: the height of the fall, the mechanism of survival through the train station skylight, and crucially, the fact that he had continued fighting even after being grievously wounded, demonstrating the kind of courage under fire that represented the best qualities of his generation. Alan Magee lived until 1903, passing away at age 84 from natural causes. His obituaries in major newspapers revisited the story of his impossible survival, introducing a new generation to the ball turret gunner who defied death in the skies over occupied France. At his funeral, fellow veterans who'd served with him or met him through veterans organizations remembered him not primarily for the fall that had made him famous, but for the quiet dignity and humility he'd shown throughout his long life afterward. His story endures not just as a tale of miraculous survival, but as a testament to the arbitrary nature of fate in war, the thin line between death and survival that soldiers navigate, and the resilience of the human body and spirit under conditions that should, by all logic and physics, be unsurvivable. On January 3, 1943, Alan Magee fell 4 miles from a disintegrating bomber with no parachute and somehow lived to tell about it, a story so impossible that it would be dismissed as fiction if it weren't meticulously documented in military records, medical journals, and the testimony of dozens of witnesses, both American and German. He became, inadvertently and unwillingly, proof that sometimes, rarely, impossibly, miracles happen even in the most brutal of human endeavors: war.